countdown to the last comic shop in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hey, it is now time for the last comic shop!
That's right, we are opening up the shop again to newbies to help them find their way underneath this comic book tent. And we're going to talk about something that everyone, I don't know, maybe thinks is not as good as it was or is better than people say it was. I don't know. We're talking about the 90s in comic books, which it has become the de rigueur for bad and or awesome. But we're not talking about Maximum Carnage, so as long as that...
We already did that!
But yes, we are keeping the lights on, which, by the way, we record these in advance. I'm hoping we actually still have lights and people and everything else. Lord only knows what's going on out there. Stay safe, everybody. But no, we are keeping the lights on for the oldies and the moldies that remember the 90s and have some of those awesome books and some of those Valiant books and some of those Maximum Press and Image and Marvel and DC's tucked away in your long boxes back there, to have learned to love all things 90s.
Maybe you can melt some of those platinum covers down and...
You keep on saying that. Like, I don't think there's actually that many precious metals in there. Like,
shh, that's my retirement fund, man.
Okay, all right.
Just don't mess with the blood strikes, with the rub the blood. Who knows what's in there?
Well, I am the host with the most, Andy Larson, and I bought quite a lot of comic books in the 90s. I think I started collecting comic books for reals, players, in the late 80s. But the 90s was primarily where I started filling up long box after long box. Because, again, I was a teenager, and I had not discovered boobs yet. There was also J.A. Scott, who bought a lot of his comic books in the 90s, and he was smart enough to get out of the...
I sold them all!
That's right.
A lot of the stuff that ended up losing massive amounts of value. I sold it at its peak, baby. I arbitraged that. Now buy them all on dollar bins, which is very depressing.
Yes. And I've also got my other co-host, Chad Smith, who, again, he bought a lot of comic books in the 90s, but he also, I feel, hung around a lot longer than J.A. and I did.
That's right. I never sold my comic books. I just kept adding more and more. And then I took a break for a little while. And then I came back and added more and more. And now my basement is overrun.
Yes. Those dark days of 1997 and 1998. Boy, I'd be hard-pressed to think of good comic books that came out during those years. But that's one thing we're going to talk about on this week's show. First and foremost, we are going to talk about a 90s series. It's J.A.'s pick, as it is the Week of J.A.
Woo. Chad gets a year. I get a week.
Yeah, we've seen your picks, buddy. Be happy with the week.
Exactly. You picked Archer and Armstrong, issues 0 through 8, because you said that you wanted to read the period of time in which Barry Windsor Smith was on the title. He was one of the co-creators of Archer and Armstrong, one of the two really major characters over at Valiant Comics, and but it turns out that he actually wrote other issues after issue 8.
I think he went through 12. You can get the trade goes 0 through 12. But 0 through 8 works because issue 8 has that nice crossover with Eternal Warrior, and it's sort of a tale told in time and a retelling of The Man in the Iron Mask by Alexander Dumas. So it works. And, 9 issues is sort of just a nice
round number. I don't know.
It's not too many, but it was substantial.
Yeah, no, it was a good.
It worked. It was enough to get an understanding of the character, and it also, I think, it tied up a lot of what had been running for the first couple of issues. His Armstrong's run-ins with the sect, and you get Andy in there and Flo, which everyone you gotta love Flo.
Well, we'll get to the dinosaur in the pond in just a second, but back to our discussion about the 90s, where you had the highest of the highs and the lowest of the lows. Again, the 90s were the decade of excess for comic books. I mean, the bubble burst. There were huge events that got national-wide attention. on comic books. Some of the most popular and the best-selling comic books ever released in America were released during this decade. But then again, you had things like Marvel going bankrupt and just tons of stuff that also...
Yeah, and I'm still pissed about that because I had Marvel stock and it's worth nothing. And look at them now. Look at them now.
I will say, if you kept your Marvel stock reports, some of those are worth some bucks. One is supposed to be the first appearance of Spidey 2099, but it's worth a lot of money now.
There you go.
Because I was so disgusted with the way that they were running the company that I owned a part of.
That's right. I was with you, buddy. I was with you. Panini? Toy Biz? You're overextending, Marvel. You're overextending.
Well, one thing we don't want to overextend is this discussion about the bad things that happened in the 90s. As a podcast that likes to accentuate the positive when it comes to comic books and hopefully bringing folks into the comic book tents, we wanted to talk about those particular comics in the 90s that we think of fondly, that we think really either had a personal stock to us or kind of moved the needle forward in terms of comic books overall. And so we're going to go ahead and start off with Chad, who is, as you may know from somebody that listens to the show a lot, our 90s guy. Like, he loves Rob Liefeld. He loves Image. He loves people with no feet. So,
and he's still got those books. We sold them all. Now in our middle age, trying to buy some of them back. Some of them in the dollar bins, other ones like $200 an issue or $100 an issue. Ridiculous. But Chad has them all.
All the different variant covers, I'm picking those up these days. Dude, this morning, picked up Rob Liefeld's first DC work, I believe. Warlord 131.
Wow.
He did one of the bonus books, and I found it in the buck bin over at our friends at Phantom of the Attic in Monroeville. Before I start, I do want to mention, because I was thinking of this initially in terms of comparing the 80s to the 90s, right? And I think when you said the highest of the highs and the lowest of the lows, I think the highs of 1980s comics are higher than the 90s. Like, you get those books like Watchmen, which we just spent 15 hours talking about. You get those books like Dark Knight Returns and the Walt Simonson Thor run and Frank Miller on Daredevil. And those things, wow, those are the best of comic books. But then outside of those things that are the absolute highlights, I feel like a lot of the rest of the 80s, at least for me, was not my scene. Now, fast forward to the 90s, and while I don't think the highs were as high, the excitement levels were off the charts. Like, for me, it's all about different families of books. And like on Batman, you had Jim Aparo and Norm Brayfogle going back and forth on the different books. Spider-Man, good golly, on Spider-Man, you had Todd McFarlane, Eric Larson, Alex Saviuk, Sal Buscema, all doing art simultaneously and all the different books in there. What a time to be alive. The X family of books. There was so much excitement around X-Men, X-Force, X-Factor, even Excalibur for a couple issues here and there. There was so much to be excited about, whether it was people lining up down the street for the death of Superman, whether it was X-Men #1 setting those big sales records, whether it was the return of quality comics after a little bit of a lull. And you got things like your Marvels and your Kingdom Come and your series that may just stop and say like, oh, wait a minute, it can be something different. I just feel like the 90s was a freight train of excitement rolling down the track, as opposed to the 80s where it's like, oh, we got some great stuff, and now here's a year and a half boring.
Wow. I'm going to kind of fight you a little bit on that, Chad.
Okay.
You know, because again, we are talking about the 90s, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But I honestly feel like the 90s were propped up by the solid foundation that the 80s set for them. The 80s may not be the glitz and glamour. It may not get the flash bulbs. But when you look at the 80s and the bedrock of the comic books that were created in the 80s, the ideas that were starting to float around in the 80s, I feel like the only reason the 90s were able to reach the heights that they did and be able to play with the medium. Like, for example, I really do say that the main reason why X-Men sold so many copies and was so exciting is because everybody was reading X-Men by the 90s. And why was that? Because everybody started reading X-Men in the 80s. They really did. So for me, the 80s were kind of like, again, they were the foundation that you can build upon. So for me, foundation is always better. Like, that's what you eat, leave a keel. And so, like, that's why I think the 80s are good. But I will say that the 90s had a lot going for it, especially early on. I feel like eventually the foundation became so rocky because they kept on building higher and higher and higher. That old 80s foundation started to crumble under its own weight. But during the early 90s, you had some really, really great stuff. You had Death of Superman, which I know, whether you think it's a good story or a bad story, it got people talking about comics in the mainstream. You had folks at CNN going to comic book shops and saying, are you picking up the Death of Superman? You had Batman with his broken back. And then you had like some of the littler indie comics. Again, you had Image, you had Dark Horse. My particular favorite comic of that time, Madman by Mike Allred, that hit the stage for me, and it made me grow up as a comic book fan. I put away childish things, and I got good things to say. I just, again, feel like it eventually crumbled under its own weight. J.A.?
Yeah, I mean, you got Image, as you said. Valiant came up. Unfortunately, it was a bit more of a flash in the pan than everything they were building, but when they were building it, so exciting, this giant new universe, and how well it was integrated with each other, which was really shown off in that great crossover series, which we did not read for today's show. In the Unity crossover, we'll have to do that at some point. But you mentioned Death of Superman. I think that was both a blessing and a curse, because it brought so many people into the comic book tent, but it also brought all this speculation in, and you had comic books selling for ridiculous amounts of money, and this massive investor bubble. People started buying comic books like they were stock options. But comic books themselves were being sort of seen as like, this is what baseball cards were in the 60s and 70s, except that baseball cards retained their value. Comic books, not so much.
The pandemic says differently. The 90s were great. Think of all the great gimmicks that happened in the 90s. Think of all the polybagged issues. Think of the multiple covers. Think of the glow-in-the-dark Ghost Rider cover. How awesome was that?
Yes.
Think of Batman, was it Shadow of the Bat that came up with a little pop-up Arkham Asylum standee in there? Think of the Death of Superman, where you would get your own Superman black armband to grieve the loss of Superman. There was so much excitement, so much experimentation. Do I need to repeat, gentlemen? Rub the blood. So many great covers. Bloodstrike, you would rub it, it would turn blood color. Think of Shadowhawk. It was so cool. There was so much cool stuff going on. And sure, there's a lot of crap eventually, but things got so big and so fun and so experimental that there's no way it could have sustained. You can't blame it for not sustaining.
Was that a Hulk issue or a Wolverine issue where there was the cover was actually cut with his
Wolverine
claws?
number 50, had the slashes through the dossier.
They were really pushing the technology of cover art and design at that time, which was kind of cool. I won't lie.
The chromium covers?
That was going to be my retirement fund, because I swear there's some precious metals in that I can resell to Apple for making their next iPhone.
They still look cool today. 30-some years later, those chromium covers have held up, sir.
I remember there was an issue of Sleepwalker where the cover was actually a Halloween mask. You could pop out the eyes. I was just like, I'm not going to do it. You know what my least favorite one were? The puffy ones. Any of the ones that were puffy, like Amazing Spider-Man 400.
Shut your mouth! Shut your mouth! Silver Surfer number 50 with the chrome puffy Silver Surfer.
Yes.
Oh, that was the best.
And then they reissued it, and they changed the cover. And so some people think that the reissue, the reprint, is actually better than the original.
No, it has that little second printing box in the corner. It's not as good. But remember Shadowhawk? Shadowhawk had that cool chrome cover. Inked by Rob Liefeld. I don't even know that, but I knew it was cool, damn it. So much cool stuff.
All right. Well, we could spend a lot of time on this week's show talking about cool covers and what was cool about the 90s, but we do have to get to an actual 90s book. So coming up right after these commercial breaks, we're going to be talking about Archer and Armstrong again, issues 0 through 8, part of our celebration of all things 90s. Stay tuned.
Whew, I need a cigarette.
BCWSupplies.com has everything a comic collector could need. Boards, bags, long boxes, and so much else for our ever so increasing collections. And you can save 10% on your total order by using promo code LCSPOD at checkout. Not only does this take 10% off BCW Supplies' already low prices, but it supports my favorite podcast, The Last Comic Shop. So get all your collecting gear at bcwsupplies.com and save 10% on your order with promo code LCSPOD at checkout. That's LCSPOD at checkout. Happy hunting!
Hi. I'm Zach Williams, son of the late Robin Williams. And while the holidays are a joyful time of year, they can also remind us of what we have lost, who won't be with us at the table, or what isn't going right in our lives when the world around us seems to be full of cheer. I'm here to tell you that there is help and there is hope. If you or someone you know is having thoughts of suicide or experiencing a mental health or substance use crisis, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline connects you to trained crisis counselors 24/7. You are not alone in crisis. Call or text 988 or chat at 988lifeline.org.
And we're back! Here we go, ready to dive into all things 90s, and we are going to start with issues 0 through 8 of the Valiant classic Archer and Armstrong. J.A., can you give us the who's it's involved in Archer and Armstrong?
Archer and Armstrong was created by Barry Windsor Smith, Jim Shooter, and Bob Layton, very much Valiant's big heavy hitters at the time. Bob Layton did the writing on issues 0 and 1 because that was the other big thing Valiant did. They put out these issue zeros, which is sort of origin stories, not always at the beginning of the runs, but issue 0 for Archer and Armstrong actually came out before they released issue 1. So he did the story on issue 0 and 1, along with Jim Shooter, who did the story on issue 0 and 1, and scripting on issue 2. Barry Windsor Smith did the story on issue 2, and then handled the bulk of the writing, all of the writing for issues 3 through 8. He also did the pencils for issues 0 through 6 and issue 8, with Art Nichols filling in as the guest penciler on issue 7. Barry Windsor Smith did the inks on issue 0, and then Bob Wyacek did 3 through 8, with Ralph Reese also helping out on issue 0, and Bob Layton issues 1 and 2.
Sounds like a great team effort there in the Valiant universe. Now, we have the who's-its. Andrew, what are the what's-its? What happens in 0 through 8 of Archer and Armstrong?
All right. Well, here's your 10-cent synopsis of the original Archer and Armstrong, issues 0 through 8. So is it the pairing of kind of the odd couple of the Valiant universe? You've got Archer, whose parents were secret evil people. I don't know. They pretended to be religious folks, but they were actually like murderers or whatever. Try to kill him. He ends up being, I think in retrospect, they make him to be a harbinger. Like he has like perfect aim or something or other.
He's the Hawkeye. He's the Hawkeye.
Yeah, whatever. He can hit anything. He can drain baskets, and you know, he eventually gets a crossbow and he thinks he's so cool and whatever. Then there's Abram
Armstrong.
Yes, who becomes Armstrong. His original name was Abram the Strong, to go with Gillen the One, who was Gillen Adipada, who's the Eternal Warrior. They're brothers, born at the beginning of time, and they can't die. They also have another brother that you meet eventually. But long story short, they meet by happenstance And the rest of the series is just their adventures walking around, deciding whether or not they want to hang out with each other, then saying that they want to hang out with each other, and then becoming good buddies. But yeah, they just have a bunch of misadventures, especially given the fact that Armstrong is considered the devil by some massive group of secret occultists called the Sect. So yeah, they're trying to kill him.
Right, who are essentially like a offshoot of the Catholic Church. So kind of on the nose on that one back in the 90s. They were.
But yeah, that's your 10-cent synopsis of Archer and Armstrong. 2 of these issues, as mentioned previously, happened during the Unity saga, which I thought was, I don't know if it was a good idea or a bad idea, to be very blunt, but just be simply because, like, you get this introduction to these 2 characters in issue 0, and then they barely get to hang out with each other very much before they're just thrown into this giant event, and you're like, here they are. And now they got to hang out in this other place. But to be honest, I didn't really give a shit because I liked Unity and I liked the story of Unity. And so, like, I don't mind that they're just there. It is just kind of, though, jarring, though, because eventually you go back in issue 3 to their other story and you're just like, oh, okay, well, that happened.
It does help fast forward that, they become sort of fast friends because Unity is a whole year.
Yeah.
And I mean, you don't know that because it's out of time, right? And time is not absolute and all this other stuff. But it took a long time for the whole Unity thing to happen. They're in that pocket universe for a long time.
Yeah, and that pocket universe has pretty awesome covers.
Yes, it does.
Frank Miller, and the second 8 are Walt Simonson.
Yeah, can we talk about those 2 issues of Unity? Because that was a really... For those folks that never read Unity, the whole storyline is in the Valiant universe that Solar Man of the Atom destroys the entire world and then recreates it. And in doing so, creates all the superheroes and everything like that. And Mother God, Erica Pierce, who's this other person that got caught in the nuclear explosion that gave Solar his powers, she also has the same powers. And she's like, no. Solar screwed up everything. So I am going to recreate it myself and bring everything back to normal. And
because as much as Solar was messed up, she needed therapy.
And you meet her son, who's just got a weird
also needed therapy.
Yeah, well, they've been together for like a billion years, and so it's real creepy. But those issues are real good. To finish off my initial thoughts, I was a real big fan of issues 0 and then 1 and 2, and then issue 3 through the Andromeda issues showed up, and I didn't like it.
I love that. That's so good. What I had forgotten about in rereading this is how adult this comic was. Things that they talk about. I mean, even you're straight in on issue 0 with Archer's origin story, where his parents are religious nuts who are taking young people and sexual deviancy and killing them and murdering them and couching it all in sort of this evangelical bent thing. I look at myself back when I was reading this, I was like, ooh, I was kind of young to be reading some of this stuff. This is kind of heavy hitting.
I mean, not as young as young Archer, who's walking in on his parents with their victim hogtied, his pants around his ankles, but still pretty young.
In issue 8, there's that very rapey scene.
Yeah. I mean, there are adult parts of this book. I applaud Barry Windsor Smith for attempting to try to do something different, and you can tell that something is different going on here. And I remember back when we read Monsters, and some of the ideas and that were thrown around eventually in that magnum opus. I think you see some of that stuff in this writing as well. Some of the themes about authority and the other, like in terms of Armstrong being chased around. But I will be very blunt. I think issues 3, 4, I didn't care for. Issues 7, whatever. Again, I liked the first 3, and then I liked the 2 issues with Andromeda because I kind of liked the dinosaur in the pond and her having magic and willy stuff. And then I liked issue 8 because basically my boy, Eternal Warrior, was in that issue.
I just saw the house ad. Did Barry Windsor Smith also do Eternal Warrior?
Yes, I mean, he was back and forth with Eternal Warrior for sure. Eternal Warrior primarily was more of a Jim Shooter book, as far as I can recall.
I think he had a hand in the creation, but it was mainly a Jim Shooter production. Jim Shooter came up with the Eternal Warrior, but then Barry Windsor Smith did issues 6, 7, and 8. So he did the run up to, and then that giant double issue, which we read because it's Archer and Armstrong and the Eternal Warrior. It was essentially a double issue with 2 front covers.
Kind of cool. You could put them side by side. But hey, issue 6 of Eternal Warrior, first appearance of Master Dark, one of the big guys back in the day. That issue was worth a lot of cash, a lot of cheddar back in the day. Some of those Valiant books. You go back in the back of Wizard, where they were like, these are the top selling comic books out there, and they were all Valiant books. And primarily, the main reason they were is because, again, Valiant was
paying Wizard.
No.
Is Eternal Warrior number 4 still worth what it used to be? Because that was the first appearance of Bloodshot. What I want to know is, did that movie make the value of the comic book go up or down?
Well, what I can say was a lot of the reasons those issues were priced the way they were is because, unlike Image that sold a lot of copies, Valiant did not, especially those early issues of Magnus Robot Fighter and Solar Man of the Atom. There weren't a lot of issues sold. And so, simply put, that is actually what makes a comic book rare, is supply and demand. Supply was very low, demand was very high. Speculators didn't understand. You have millions of copies of Spawn #1. It's not going to be worth very much because there are millions of copies of it.
Yeah, but if you put it in a giant plastic slab and slap a 9.8 on it, it's totally worth something, man. It's totally worth something.
Is it really? Yeah. Let's get to Chad, though. I mean, again, Chad is not a huge fan of Valiant. He didn't read Valiant growing up like you and I did, J.A. I'm sure that if he had been friends with you, J.A., he would have, because you would have made him. By hook or by crook, you would have been like, well, they're here. Why don't you read them?
I would have, yes. Chad, I would have brought you in. I would have sucked you in.
There you go. Evangelical in his own right. So I'm shocked that Barry Windsor Smith was doing 2 books simultaneously, just because he doesn't seem like the type of artist that lends himself to quick turnarounds. But no, I enjoyed this. This was lots of fun. I will say, as far as Barry Windsor Smith work, it's not on the top of my charts, but at the same time, if I were reading this back in the early 90s when it was coming out, I could see myself going a long way, or at least until Barry Windsor Smith quit. I like the neophyte and Archer who just doesn't know things, and then Armstrong, who's literally been around forever and seen everyone and knows everything. He has that whole Wolverine quality to him. He can't be killed, and he knows everybody, and he knows all the secret passages, and he knows, oh, this place is where they used to store the wine, and oh, this is, oh, no, it's vinegar now. But it was just a good time. I was actually the opposite of Andy a little bit. The Unity crossover didn't land with me nearly as much. I was kind of shocked that happened so quickly. You get one origin issue, and then bam, Solar and everyone else shows up, and Turok is there pointing weapons at these guys, and that was a bit of a shock. And without having a ton of experience with those other characters, I don't know how effective that was. But when we go back and read the rest of Valiant Unity, maybe I'll pick up those pieces that I'm missing. But I enjoyed the issues where it was Archer and Armstrong going on their misadventures, and Archer learning the ways of the world, and sometimes getting real angry and because of his past, and then Armstrong just being that guy that knows everything and is a little bit gruff and a little bit rough, but still he knows his way around. And so, I don't know, characterization wise, I really enjoyed it. And it's Barry Windsor Smith art. How can you complain about that? That's awesome.
What I love about it is the humor. I had forgotten how humorous it was and how funny the interactions were. And it's not like a quippy humor. It's like a belly laugh type of humor. I mean, Armstrong, he gets into this chopper is hovering around trying to kill him, and he goes out and he moons the chopper, and then he throws a couch That's how he disposes of the chopper. He throws a couch at the chopper.
Yes.
Because the chopper is shooting up his house and destroying his original painting that is not in the Louvre because the Louvre has the copy. He's got the original. That was one of the issues with Andy and Flo the dinosaur, who's essentially a cat.
Well, and that's the thing.
Or a dog.
Those issues were some of my favorites. I liked Andy. I liked Flo. I thought those issues. Again, the thing is, when you read most of this, of all of the Valiant books from that particular era, I really thought that Archer and Armstrong had the most of the episodic quality to it, where like a lot of the other Valiant books were kind of caught up in these multi-issue story arcs that would, last 10, 12 issues. There's a little bit of that going on. Obviously, the sect following Archer and trying to kill him is like an undertone. But really, for the most part, most of these stories are like 1 or 2 issue, one and done episodic adventures where they go this place and then they go to this place and then they go to this place. And so as you're learning about these two characters, as they're traveling around and learning about each other, it sometimes was difficult for me to see, I guess, the point of the series. And that's because primarily I also read the newer Archer and Armstrong that was done by Fred Van Lente when Valiant was reborn in, about 10 years ago.
One of the many times Valiant
Yeah.
was reborn.
And that particular issue was a lot more tight when it came to storyline of Archer and Armstrong and so I think they learned from some of that. I think there's some still rough edges in these particular issues. And I will say to Chad, Image did know how to craft a pretty compelling cover. And some of these covers for Archer and Armstrong, pretty bland.
You're of course talking about issues 3 through 7, because issue 8, I will have you know, is a great cover, and issues 1 and 2 have Frank Miller and Walt Simonson art, and they form giant posters with all the other Unity books.
Fair enough. I think it's issue 4. I think issue 4 is a very, very bland cover.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. That one's not the strongest, but I think issue 3 is a solid cover. Issue 6 has Flo on it. Issue 5, we've got the postcard. I wouldn't knock these covers. I think they're pretty solid. I don't know. I think what Image was able to cultivate a lot more was just that excitement freight train of the 90s. You never knew what was going to happen. And while the books they existed in a similar universe, and sometimes you'd have, Chapel crossing over into Spawn, or you would have references of, Savage Dragon showing up here or there. It was more like the classic days of Marvel where Thor would just be flying by somebody's building. And you didn't necessarily have to read everybody's book to understand the full grasp of what's going on. Whereas I think with Valiant, it was very much contingent on if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound, and you're going to have to read all the books. And I like being able to pick and choose, and maybe I'll read Youngblood but not Brigade or that sort of thing.
I mean, JA was in it for a penny for a pound, because I think at one point you were buying every single book.
Yeah, Unity got me, man. Unity was not just a great crossover, but what a marketing gimmick, because it made you have to read all these different books, especially Archer and Armstrong. You're like, oh, I'm on the beginning of the series. I might as well start buying it. And Eternal Warrior and I think Shadow Man also 3 and 4 or 5 and 6 or something very early on.
Long, yeah.
So you could go back. I mean, it wasn't the only ones that were really difficult at that point to buy were Solar and Magnus the Robot Fighter, because they were already in their teens and they had a year under them, and you couldn't find those issues anywhere.
Yeah, that's why they were so expensive.
Yeah.
Although now they're in buck bins. So.
Yes. But let's talk about the piece de resistance of what we read. And I use that term purposefully because it is a retelling of the French tale, The Man in the Iron Mask by Alexander Dumas. Issue 8, Eternal Warrior and Archer and Armstrong double issue. You get Ivar, the Time Walker, shows up.
Had we met Ivar the Time Walker by that point?
I think it was his introduction.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a weird story because you read that issue and you really do think that like Archer and Armstrong have traveled back in time, but it turns out that Archer is just D'Artagnan. For some bizarre reason, we're like getting to see D'Artagnan as Archer.
I just thought it was so fun. It was like, yeah, they kept his name, but everyone else's name was changed because they didn't want to get sued.
But I will say that I love that issue so much. Why? Because it was a great Eternal Warrior story. It was a great Eternal Warrior story. You got the Eternal Warrior, you got the Geomancers.
Who's a dick in it.
That's fine. That's what he is.
No,
He's
but
Dylan
I know
Adipata.
that's what I love that it's so condensed who he was to this, like, he's the what would they call it, the
fist in the steel of the earth.
Fist in the steel, yes.
Yes. And
But it turns out all it is that great line at the end is like, for everything that he says he is, he's essentially just a man who doesn't know how to deal with a woman.
And it is true. At one point, the Geomancer turns around and says, like, we're not paying you to think. We're paying you to punch people. Like, that's what your job is. Let me do all the thinking. And he's like, okay. But I love the Eternal Warriors. So, like, any opportunity for Gillen and our Abram to play off each other. I think that's what I liked about the Fred Van Lente run that was, about 10 years ago, was their interactions between the two of them. I don't know. It's just kind of cool to think of two immortal brothers, that the one's the fist in the steel and the other one's the bread and the butter, or the meat and the cheese, the
meat and potatoes.
Cole cocks him in the face. So yeah, no, it was a good issue. Chad, you were the English major. What did you think of that one?
I've actually never read Dumas, because I would just be like, dumbass, and I'd just giggle and couldn't concentrate. And so that's as far as I made it. But no, it was another one that was tons of fun. The whole Geomancer stuff, I've only heard in vague terms, so figuring that stuff out was a trip. But for all of the convoluted notions, you still just had the conflict between these two brothers. Like, anybody could understand that. Anybody could follow along with that story. And so I don't know. There's something special about characters like Armstrong. I'm shocked that, I shouldn't say I'm shocked that he's had so many starts and stops. I'm shocked that it hasn't stuck. Like, I feel like there's a room in the universe for these types of buddy comedies. And the fact that Valiant has had to have so many reboots and restarts is a shame, because I think this is something that could definitely be its own niche out there, including or excluding the Eternal Warrior and all that comes along with that stuff. But I don't know. Put him in a spot, and then whatever, it's going to be Archer now instead of D'Artagnan. Yeah, that's cool. Whatever it takes. I like it.
All right. Well, one thing that we hope that you'll take is our ratings, and that will be right after these commercial breaks. So stay tuned for more of The Last Comic Shop.
Dumbass. Alexander, dumbass.
If you're an indie creator looking for a home for your comic book, graphic novel, short story collection, or novel, then you've come to the right place. Any One World is a full-service publisher and distributor which can take your creator-owned project and showcase it to the world. We offer two primary distribution channels: digital distribution, where we'll sell your book in our digital bookstore; digital and print distribution, where we'll sell your book in our digital bookstore and distribute through physical bookstores across the UK, USA, and Canada. In addition to distribution, Any One World can also work with you to publish your book. We'll publish your book digitally, helping you source artists, edit, format, and publish your book in digital format. Digital and print. We'll publish your book digitally and produce and distribute print copies of your work. Digital, print, and merch. We'll publish digital and print copies of your book and then work with you to design or distribute products and add-ons such as t-shirts, posters, and more. On top of all of this, we can offer additional paid services where required, specifically cover design, editing, and formatting. Unlike many traditional publishers, Any One World gives indie creators maximum control and flexibility over publishing and distribution. So if you're looking to partner with us to distribute existing books or publish something new, read carefully through the information below and fill out a submission form.
We're all familiar with the Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, and Modern Age of comics, but we can't still be in the Modern Age after almost 4 decades, can we?
We don't think so. And that's why we started the Iron Age of Comics, a critical re-evaluation of comic books from about 1985 to 2000.
On this podcast, we go beyond the chromium covers and the grim and gritty cliches and take a deep dive into one of the most vibrant but divisive periods in comics history.
That's the Iron Age of Comics, with new episodes every first and third Wednesdays of the month. And look for us on social media, where the handle is @IronAgeOfComics.
All right, we're back with more of The Last Comic Shop, and it is now time for ratings, where you don't have to be immortal and wait around forever to get to this particular portion of the show. In fact, there's a little fast forward button if you really just didn't want us to talk about the book at all. And you're just like, I just want to hear what they think. Well, here's what we think. 1 out of 4 scale comes from J.A. Scott. J.A., what are we rating? The first 9 issues of the original Archer and Armstrong run.
1 out of 4 vintage bottles of wine.
Ooh.
This book really has aged like a nice vintage, I would say. It has not become vinegar. It is really fantastic. I'm so glad we were able to revisit it. I'm also glad that we did this as a precursor to next year doing the whole Unity saga when you pick it. Because
if you're waiting around for me to use one of my picks for Unity, we're going to be here until season 6. I'll tell you that much.
So good. It's so comedic. It's highbrow, but not super highbrow that it's inapproachable. It's adult. It deals with adult themes. It's buddy comedy. You have this one character who's a neophyte, but is, essentially the Hawkeye. And then he's paired up with someone who, by all rights, should be this Superman type person, but is really just a raconteur who has lived his life drinking and being debaucherous, throws sofas at helicopters, and moons the guy who's shooting up his house, because that's how you fight. This person who's lived forever and has seen everything and doles out that bit of wisdom issue by issue. I just love this book. I'm so glad we read it. The Barry Windsor Smith art is not his best, I would agree. If you are looking for that, maybe you look at the Weapon X miniseries he did, or some of his one-shots from the 80s in the X-Men. But how much heavy lifting he was doing for the Valiant universe at the time. He did this. He did the beginning and end of that Unity crossover. He was doing issues of Eternal Warrior, did a lot of the Solar Man of the Atom stuff early on. I mean, he was seriously their all-star player. Shohei Ohtani type pitching and batting at the same time. So being able to read him at really the height of his combined powers, So I'm giving it a 4. It's a 4 vintage bottles of wine. That's right. This is not vinegared at all. Pour it out. Pour some on the ground for your homies as well.
Oh.
It was totally worth it. Oh, so glad. and we didn't even get into that whole your favorite. Maybe you should talk about those issues with Andromeda, who is the Greek god. Yes, but she doesn't want people to know it.
Well, I did enjoy those issues, and they recaptured my interest in the particular series. Unlike J.A., I can't give as high marks to this particular run of books as he might have. But then again, I was never a huge Archer and Armstrong fan. I remember when we were teenagers and he was buying all the issues of Archer, he was throwing them at me. He's like, oh, you should read it. And I was just like, I'm more interested in his brother. I mean, those issues of Eternal Warrior, that's more my
Andrew likes the fascists. That's right. He likes the fascists.
Well,
don't say that this week. Going on out there.
One thing I will say is that I don't think that this particular series aged as well, especially since I've read the recent reboot by Fred Van Lente. I think that series does these characters much better. It's a little more funny. Just because you get Fred Van Lente writing. And if you know anything about Fred Van Lente, he's hilarious. I don't think Barry Windsor Smith is he may be a little more highbrow. His comedy might be a little more, for the silver spoon set. But for those regular Joes that want some good old fashioned meat and potatoes like Armstrong is purported to be, Yeah, I just think it was kind of hit or miss. So I'm going to give this a 2. This is an average comic book from that particular period. It's a 2.
Turn off his microphone. You're not allowed to judge anymore.
There are some issues that are good. There are some issues that are bad. I don't really think they had a lot to do in Unity. I kind of like the first issue where they were in Unity, where they were like, oh, Archer is like some leader of some ancient religion and something, and then they find out that he's just a dude, and they're like, oh, you should never meet your heroes. And that was kind of neat. But then like there's just a Turok issue that's just thrown in there, and you're just like, all right, we just got to introduce Turok, and it's cool, but then we're back to the sect, and we're just like, okay, they're chasing these people around. And again, it picks up because you get a dinosaur, which is kind of neat, and a beautiful woman, which is kind of cool. And then you get that issue with the Three Musketeers, which was also neat. So it's not terrible. And I think if you...
It should be at least a 2.5.
I mean, it's a 2! No! It is an average book of the 90s. I hope that at some point we'll read Unity, so I'm hoping at some point J.A. will pick.
I quit.
Oh,
Chad, we got a 4, we got a 2. You in the middle?
I am. I'm going to split the difference and go with a 3. I think this was fun. Like I said, if I were reading this back in the early 90s, I'd be with it until the inevitable firing of Jim Shooter and Valiant going off the rails and everything else. But as far as like writer, artists, I think Barry Windsor Smith shows some of those Image guys how to do it. I didn't think there were lulls. I didn't think anything was bad. I did think the series was a little uneven. Like I said, I was thrown a bit with the Unity crossover, but I enjoyed all the Archer and Armstrong traveling around, and like each issue would bring something else fun. We didn't talk about the kid that steals the satchel, starts just getting whatever he wants.
Yeah.
And like people are like, that was such a fun conceit. It's like the Purple Man, but at 12.
And like the other kid just steals it off him. He's like, I will have 6 Nintendos. Don't worry about that.
But yeah, no, I was intrigued to see where that goes, and I may or may not ever get there. But I enjoyed it. It's Barry Windsor Smith, so it's hard not to like the art. I thought the stories were fun. I thought there was something different every time. Is it something that I'm going to go back and hold in like super high esteem or regard? I don't know if it's that, but as far as 90s books go, give it a try. It might be your thing.
All right. And if that is not your thing, or it is, make sure that you're also checking out some of our recommendations. Yes, this is our time of every single show where we talk about other comic books in addition to Archer and Armstrong, issues 0 through 8, which you can get in a variety of different ways. Not only can you probably find some of those issues in buck bins, again, all of us here have put together our own collections of Unity out of buck bins. So, like, it's there for the taking if you're willing to comb through some of those issues. You can get all of them. Or you can get them in collections, right, J.A.?
Yeah, so there's a trade that you can get. They just came out, I think, earlier this year or late last year, which is paperback, and it collects issues 0 through 12, which is essentially the Barry Windsor Smith run on Archer and Armstrong. There is an omnibus that collects all of the original Valiant Archer and Armstrong. That's 0 through 26. That one, very expensive and hard to find because it was printed, I think, like 2019 or 2018. It's hard to find. But the trade that I read, it's like $20, $30 on Amazon. You can also get it, as you said, in buck bins. I mean, it's going to take you a little bit longer maybe to get it, but just as cheap to buy all the issues single issue as to get the trade. So you're not saving money, you're not losing money. It's just, how do you want to read the book?
Listen, sometimes I've got 50-cent sales in those buck bins, buddy. That's where my Archer and Armstrong collection comes from. But Jay, so one issue that I know Valiant has had is that they didn't own all of their characters outright, like Solar and the Magnus, the robot fighter guy. Can Valiant reprint issues with those characters?
Yes, yeah. Issues 1 and 2 are in here. Yeah.
Okay.
And Solar shows up. He shows up in like issue 12 or issue 11. It's one of those things where it's like the Hulk, right? He can be in other movies, but he can't be in his own movie without getting into rights. So you can have those characters in other issues and they can reprint them, but they can't be on the cover. They can't have their title
I see. Well, that's kind of interesting.
So you couldn't do Unity because while issues 0 and 1 of Unity and a lot of the Archer and Armstrongs and the Harbinger and Shadow Man books would be fine, you wouldn't be able to do the Solar books or the Magnus Robot Fighter books, so that you're losing 4 chapters of Unity straight off. They wouldn't be able to reprint them.
And speaking of Unity, by the way, we've got 2 folks that have the same recommendation this week. That's right. J.A. and Chad are going to tag team on talking about Unity and why they think it's something that you should check out.
Because I've recommended this like 6 times, I think. And this and also, if you like Barry Windsor Smith, you owe it to yourself to pick up his Weapon X miniseries. That's also great. But Unity, we're going to read it next year. It's going to be one of Andrew's picks.
He keeps on saying that, but it's not.
It is what I had forgotten. So Unity Day 1, that's when all the superheroes from the Valiant universe go into the Lost Land. And we see that in Archer and Armstrong issue 1. And then Unity doesn't end until day 158. There's half a year that they're in Unity. And I guess it makes sense now because that's they were putting these books out, right?
Yeah.
So it's 6 months and 2 months.
Right.
Something
exactly.
Like that.
It was a summertime extravaganza. They were like, buy all our books in the summer while you're there.
Plus, because it's a Valiant thing, the kickoff to Unity was Unity 0. And then the conclusion to the Unity was Unity issue 1.
Yeah.
There you go. And I saw a note in one of the issues from Jim Shooter about how they didn't print enough copies of Unity 0.
Yeah, it was one of those. It was one of those ones that was also very, very expensive. And then you had all these variant covers, and variant covers in that day and age, they weren't different artists. They were just like, we're going to put blue in the background, or we're going to put red in the background. Oh, it's the red background Unity cover. It's the same cover. It's just the border was different colors. I mean, it's
well, why do you want to read it, Chad? This is also your recommendation.
Yeah, well, I haven't. And so I read chapters 3 and 11, and on JA's recommendation, time and time again, every time I've seen Unity books in the back issue bins or come across a sale, I'm like, oh, I gotta get these Unity books. And so I just came back from a trip where I was out of state, and I actually picked some of these up and stuck them in my book bag on the way home. So I got them all now. Might as well read them.
Well,
and they're helpfully at the top of every issue. It tells you which chapter of the Unity crossover you're in, so you can read them in order.
Yeah, and this made no sense going 3 to 11. 3 and 11 seemed like they were very much so connected. But what happened?
Is interesting, right? Because they not only work as standalone stories, but they also, telling the greater Unity story. Some of the Unity crossover issues are much more involved with the Solar issues, and the Magnus issues to a lesser extent are much more involved, I think.
Hey man, it's levels on levels, and I want to see how it happens.
Well, here's hoping that one of you 2 gentlemen makes it one of your picks in our 5th season, because I ain't doing it. In any case, my recommendation this week has nothing to do with Valiant Comics. It actually has to do with a superhero that we talked about a couple weeks back when we talked about the mighty Thor. Now, during that particular show, Chad made a comment about there weren't really a lot of great Thor runs prior to Walt Simonson. And that was true to a certain extent. There weren't a ton of great Thor runs prior, and nothing to the extent that nowadays we equate with Thor like Walt Simonson's run. But there was kind of a neat little run that happened in the tail end of the 200s into 300, written by Roy Thomas, who we have interviewed on this show. Make sure you're checking out our archives for that interview with Roy. And it had art by John Buscema, who's always wonderful on Thor, and into Keith Pollard, who kind of also comes from that, Kirby, John Buscema kind of school of Thor, but it is called the Eternal Saga. This is one of the mage stories that actually brought the Eternals into the Marvel Universe. Now, when I say that, a lot of folks out there might be very confused because they might be thinking, oh, well, they had made a Marvel movie with the Eternals, right? They must have always been a part of the Marvel Universe. Well, then, no, that wasn't the case. When Jack Kirby first came back to Marvel in the 70s, he wanted to have complete creative control over his characters. And in fact, he wanted his characters to be completely separate from the rest of the Marvel Universe. And so when he created the Eternals at Marvel, they had absolutely nothing to do, really, with the Marvel 616. So once Jack Kirby kind of started having a falling out with Marvel, they decided to start incorporating some of these ideas that he came up with into the Marvel Universe proper. In this particular Thor run, the first volume of which collects issues 283 through 291, tells the story about how Thor first meets the Eternals and how he first meets the Celestials and how it starts setting the table for how Odin created the Destroyer so that the Destroyer could fight the Celestials whenever they came back to Earth. And I think it's great because it's all in a Thor book, which if you think back to the original ideas that Jack Kirby had, originally the New Gods, which he did at DC, they were all supposed to be in the Thor book. Like the New Gods were supposed to be in the Thor book. He went over to DC, created the New Gods. He came back. He's like, I still like the New Gods ideas. I'll do the Eternals. So like it's eventually just bringing the Eternals into always been one of the big cosmic characters at Marvel, which is Thor. So I would highly recommend that you check it out. It does go into a second volume eventually, into the Eternal Saga Volume 2, which leads up to issue 300. Yeah. If you like the Eternals, if you like that movie, if you like Thor, if you like the cosmic side of Marvel, kind of a neat set of books written by somebody that knew a lot about Marvel continuity with Roy Thomas and was able to kind of pull into all these things like, how can there be Eternals? And they're all based on the Greek gods. If we already have Greek gods like Hercules and Zeus, like we already have those characters. He melds it together, kind of makes it work, makes that suit.
It's always good because I think the Eternals are one of those set of characters that Marvel never seems to know what to do with. I mean, even the MCU, they just butchered it, unfortunately. They're good. That run that we read, was it last year or 2 years ago?
The Neil Gaiman, John Romita stuff.
Yeah, so good.
The Jack Kirby stuff is so crazy and awesome. And
yeah, anytime you can get good Eternals stories is a good thing.
But yeah, I hope you guys check it out. I mean, again, it's not Walt Simon's, but it's still good. I think it's worth a read. And one thing that I hope is also worth at least a listen is more episodes of The Last Comic Shop. We're going to be around for a long, long time, at least until season 6, when eventually I run out of other recommendations and I choose Unity, because that's how long it's going to take for me to put a Valiant book out there. Just saying. But you can rate, review, and subscribe so you don't miss any of the episodes leading up to that point. See, I'm teasing it years out. So if you want to listen to eventually our Unity review, make sure you rate, reviewing, and subscribing over at www.lastcomicshoppodcast.com. You can be an eternal warrior for us, an eternal fan warrior of The Last Comic Shop. So we hope that you come and check us out on all those podcasting platforms and YouTube every single week.
So check out our shows where I'm going to be pushing for Deathmate as well.
Deathmate?
The
No,
Valiant Image crossover. Yes, Deathmate.
we have to read Unity first, because Unity sets the stage for Deathmate. It's like,
So you've picked it. Good.
Yeah, there you go.
I've not picked it. Get to the rest of the show, Chad.
All right. So we like being the Last Comic Shop podcast. We don't want to be the Last Comic Shop, so we encourage you to get out there to the comic shops near you. Dig through those buck bins. Dig through those back issue bins. Find all those Valiant classics that are there waiting, that were once held in such high esteem and still probably should be in some cases. But today we read Archer and Armstrong. That's out there. We've been talking a whole lot about Valiant, Unity, and Deathmate, which are on the calendar. Write it down. And then Andy also recommended Thor, the Eternal Saga. Oh, and don't forget about the other Barry Windsor Smith stuff like Weapon X, or Andy brought up Monsters, which he just put out recently. And it's just, oh, wow. So much great stuff from Barry Windsor Smith out there. But all that and more waits for you at your local comic shop. And then go back to our website, which is www.lastcomicshoppodcast.com, where you can find all sorts of things like what, J.A.?
We have a link to our merch store. We always sell t-shirts, coffee mugs, hats, tote bags, perfect for picking up your pool pile. And this week, a special on Valiant-themed hair clippers so that you can shave your head except for that little ponytail in the back and look like Archer.
There you go. I thought we were going to get a satchel with all sorts of fun eternal knickknacks and stuff in there.
Yeah,
So we
I
could have
need
all
to
our-
go. I was looking through to try to find if that was ever resolved, and I can't find it. I don't think it's ever been. I think there was one of the threads that got left when Barry Windsor Smith left that book.
Oh, no.
I'm at issue 19 now, and he hasn't got his satchel back, and they haven't come back to that story. So maybe they do at some point, but I can't find it.
Listen, Fred Van Lenzie, we're putting the call out to you, sir.
That's sad. Because there's that one page where he's got a Lamborghini and, like, again, 6 Nintendos. I know that if I was a kid, I would be like, 6? Where are you going to put them all? What are you, Bill Gates? You got all that Nintendo money?
Yeah, I don't know if Barry Windsor Smith is going to come back and do Archer Armstrong, so maybe we can get that Fred Van Lenzie to pick it up.
Well, you don't need a magic satchel to save some money on your comic book supplies, right, Chad?
Nope, you could just go to bcwsupplies.com and enter our code LCSPOD for 10% off all of your comic supplies, backing boards, and even card supplies and things of that nature. That saves you 10% and also gives us a little bit of appreciation as well. And so anybody that wants to go to BCW Supplies and use our promo code LCSPOD, we really appreciate it.
All right. And until next week, when I'm the host with the most, Andy Larson, I was joined by Chad Smith and J.A. Scott, and we hope that you stay safe, stay eternal. That's right. And remember that if you want to listen to Unity next year as one of our reviews, make sure that you post on social media that is your pick. Not mine, not Chad's, not J.A.'s. It's your pick as fans. Then I still get picks because they seem to like to screw me out of picks, right? They're like, oh, you pick the movie review pick.
You tell us everything to pick.
Yeah!
It's not my pick, but if you want to make this your
Fake
pick,
news.
I suggest we read this book.
Fake
Yeah.
news.
Hey, Chad, you have a pick this month. It has to be an image book. It has to be written and drawn by Rob Liefeld. And it has to fit in between this time period and that time period. It could be anything you want.
It's got to start with young and end with blood.
The Last Comic Shop podcast was a 2024 Black Angus production.